Feeling good, wanna feel great. Longevity starts, don't hesitate. Too much noise, what do you choose? Trendy hacks, conflicting news. Skip the myths, come hear what's true. From world-class experts straight to you. First and third Thursdays, 7 p.m. Science, health, and our team. Brain to heart, from food to rest. Live the talk on living your best. At 7, we'll see you there.
What proportion might be driven through immunosenescence?
Ooh, that's a really good one. So I think it depends on the context of what condition you're looking at. With natural aging, I think there's a lot that's there. I think if you're looking in the context of NASH, it's going to be much more metabolically driven, right? That's what we have to do more of, this inter-organ communication of aging.
How do you see in your translational work, maybe in the future, how we would use rapamycin, mTOR inhibition versus the removal and senolytics? So could you think about combinations of it?
Most definitely. So there's a study that's done by Daohong Zhu where they took older mice and treated them with the senolytic targeting the BCL2 family, and it was able to rejuvenate HSCs as well, right? So that could be a really good combinatorial therapeutic.
Welcome to the National University of Singapore Yonglou Lin School of Medicine Healthy Longevity webinar. I'm Vincenzo Sorrentino, Assistant Professor at the NUS Healthy Longevity Translation Research Program. Thank you for joining us. What you just saw was a snapshot from our last episode with Professor Matthew Youssef Zande about rapamycin on immune rejuvenation. You can catch the full episode on YouTube. Today we have actually with us Dr. Dushani Palliyaguru. And before that, I would like to remind you about the use of the Q&A function to send questions. And tonight we have Fukai Zhang, a research fellow in our program, with us to moderate your questions. Let's learn more about him first.
Hey there.
Oh, hi.
Hi.
Hi, nice to meet you. This is Fukai Zhang. I'm a postdoc researcher from Brian Kennedy Lab at the National University of Singapore. As you can see, I'm in the lab. So let me just introduce myself briefly. I obtained my PhD degree in molecular life science from Switzerland, University of Bern. I would say like Switzerland is a very beautiful country, and I formed this kind of habit like hiking, cycling from Switzerland. Oh, here's a video about the very nice view of Switzerland. Okay, it's time to go back to the scientific part. As you can see, I'm looking at this kind of figure. All these kind of results come from flow cytometry, which is a very not that advanced nowadays, but it's still very advanced technology. The y-axis means the marker of one cell. The x-axis is another marker. So from this figure, you can separate or you can identify how those kind of cells express some specific marker, like the right circle here. It shows the human cell in mouse tissue, which is exactly what I'm doing. So I'm trying to find out like how human stem cell can survive in mouse tissue after intramuscular injection. Actually, which is amazing. Like from here, you can see this kind of human cell can survive in mouse tissue for at least 7 days, which is amazing, which is quite useful. If a human cell can survive in mouse for longer time, then maybe in the future we don't need to worry about like the transplantation issues. We can just apply this human cell into clinical trial. It would be good, I think.
Could you tell us, ever since joining our team, what has been your biggest takeaway?
Actually, the biggest takeaway information could be like, still, the aging research is my favorite topic. Secondly, our lab is a very, very nice lab, and we are all focusing on aging research. We are trying to contribute to the super age society, and Professor Brian Kennedy and every lab member, we are trying our best to slow down the aging progress and promote the healthy longevity. So please focus on our research, and if you can, join us, contribute to the super aging society. Thanks.
And what are you doing to improve your own healthy longevity?
Actually, that's a good question. So, first of all, I think the most useful information to me is sleep earlier, wake up earlier. That's my favorite life routine. And another thing is, I think the calorie restriction is quite useful. So don't eat too much. 70% full. That's good. Yeah.
That's wonderful. And if we want to follow you for more, how can we do so?
That's a good question.
Or is social media not your thing?
I'm not that kind of people. I'm a bit shy, so for social media, it's not my favorite part. But I think social media and spread the word is the most important thing. It's another very important thing to scientific research. So, for example, like every day we do a lot of research work, but if nobody can let other people know, nobody can spread the word, we are just doing something, but nobody knows.
In that case, our followers, please follow our HLTRP social media, and that's where we'll post more things about Pukai.
Yeah, follow it, please.
All right, thank you so much, Pukai.
Thank
we'll
you.
see you soon.
See you soon. And this result because I already started this one, so.
Thank you, Fukai, for the nice introductory video about stuff. That brings good memories to my actually stay in Switzerland when I used to work there. Beautiful place. And also thanks for introducing about your work. I think cell therapy, developing further this technology will be very important in the years to come. And with this, now I want to introduce our guest of today, that is Dr. Dushani Palliyaguru, co-founder and CEO of HealthSurveil, a health tech startup focused on preventing aging-related chronic diseases. She holds a PhD from the University of Pittsburgh and has worked at the National Institute of Aging, using big data to uncover molecules linked to aging and cognitive health. With over a decade of experience across academia, government, and biotech, she also contributes to global panels like the WHO and speaks widely on longevity and disease prevention. And the topic of today that she will talk about will be about preserving cognition for healthy aging. Dushani, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Vincenzo, and thank you for the organizers for giving me the opportunity today to speak to you guys. It was said before, my name is Dushani, and I am part of HealthSurveil, which is a health tech organization that I co-founded, which is based in Texas in the US. So that's where I am. So good evening to all of you in Singapore. So today I'm going to talk about how we can preserve cognition for healthy aging, going from really risk to resilience. And this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. It's something that I've become very recently interested. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background about work that I have done in the past, work that we are currently doing, as well as work that's been done by others in the field. So initially, I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about what we do, and then I'll introduce the topic, stating the obvious, really, why is the brain so important? Then I'll talk a little bit about brain aging and dementia, focusing on risk factors and the epidemiology. Then I'll go on to talk about how we can build resilience against impacts of brain aging and dementia. So in a nutshell, we at HealthSurveil, what we do is we develop technologies, products, and services for healthy aging and disease prevention. We use an approach that's integrated precision prevention through tracking and targeting of biology, behaviors, and environmental exposures. We've worked with several organizations in the past, and we continue to work with them There are many organizations that have a common mission in this space, which is really exciting to see as well. Very quickly, how did I get started in healthy longevity? I have a PhD in environmental and occupational health, which is a branch of toxicology from University of Pittsburgh, where my focus was really disease prevention. But it got to a point when I was doing my second postdoctoral fellowship, since I was doing disease prevention, it really got me thinking about the role that aging plays in disease and disease prevention. And the fact that aging really is the #1 risk factor for almost all chronic diseases. That's really how I got started. And then I went and did a postdoctoral fellowship at the National Institute on Aging at the Translational Gerontology branch, where I did a lot of work using large longitudinal data sets and trying to use those data sets to identify novel biomarkers of aging, and also utilizing those data sets then to identify novel interventions for aging and longevity, focusing on pharmacological and dietary interventions. It was also during this time that I became very interested in cognition and Alzheimer's disease, because I was involved in a couple of projects that was looking at how we could use certain dietary ingredients and also certain diets like the Mediterranean diet to improve outcomes that were related to Alzheimer's disease. So since then, I got hooked, and I haven't really, been able to turn my attention away from cognitive health. So why is the brain so important? The way I look at this is really the brain is our gateway to our environments, our surroundings, the way we really communicate, the way we keep in touch with what's around us, right? And we do this through learning, intelligence, emotions, performance, empathy, imagination, curiosity, decision-making, memory. And very importantly, we also know that the brain plays an incredibly important role in regulating physiological health as well, that happens through peripheral organs. So in a nutshell, this is the organ that makes us who we are. Unfortunately, as we get older, there are some changes that happen in the brain, some changes that are pathological that could lead to disease, and some changes that are not necessarily pathological. So this is a hypothetical diagram. On the left, what you see is of what might be happening in the general population when it comes to cognitive decline related to aging. So the orange line sort of shows what happens with normal aging. So as you might realize, there's a little bit of loss of memory here and there, and then you're not as sharp as you used to be. You may have some motor deficits as well. However, it's not necessarily pathological. The problem really arises when you start going into the pathological conditions, such as with mild cognitive impairment that may lead to dementia later on, where you do see a steady decline in cognitive performance over time. And this depends, the age of onset depends really on various different factors for different individuals. But in the general population, more or less, we start seeing these starting around 60s and 70s. And then with dementia, this trajectory seems to be even more aggressive and going downwards very fast. There are different types of dementia. So on the right side, what you see is a schematic that was developed by the NIA for awareness purposes, which shows the different types of dementia. And there are many others as well. So there are a few listed here. And then you might be able to appreciate that there are distinctions between these types of dementia in terms of what happens in the changes of the brain, and also the symptoms that you see, and also the age of onset of dementia. So it's very important, if you have any doubt about whether there could be dementia in somebody it's very important that you get a very proper diagnosis as to what's going on, because that will really determine the course of action after that. At the molecular level, so if you take a step back, there are many changes that govern what's happening inside the body and also inside our brains, the way we sort of, we age and our brains age. And I wanted to quickly highlight two studies. One study was published in Nature earlier this year that looked at brain-wide and cell-type specific transcriptomic changes in healthy aging in mice. So here what you really see is that in this study, they were able to see global changes related to transcriptomic changes that really represented increased immune responses and increased inflammatory responses. Again, this is something that we have sort of seen already in other studies as well. And then also a global reduction in transcriptomic pathways that were involving neurogenesis, neuronal signaling, neuron structural integrity, and so on. And this happened across different cell types. The second study is very interesting as well. This was published in 2024 in Nature Medicine that really showed the diversity in the trajectories that we can take in terms of brain aging. So in this study, what the authors did was they used a deep learning algorithm to identify 5 different trajectories of brain aging in a large cohort of individuals of almost 50,000 people. And then they identified 5 trajectories. Out of these 5, what was really interesting is depending on which trajectory you belong to, these trajectories were differentially associated with the type of disease you will develop and also your mortality risk. So if anybody's interested in this type of work, I really encourage you to read this. Cognitive decline is a slow march. It happens over time. In some cases, not just years, but really sometimes it takes decades. So this is data from the Seattle longitudinal study where they looked at a cohort of about 25 to 88 people. And they looked at various different parameters that are associated with intelligence and performance. So what you see is for most of the parameters like verbal ability, inductive reasoning, verbal memory, spatial orientation, numeric ability, not the last two. What you see is there's an increase until about your 40s and 50s, and then there's a reduction. Interestingly, for numeric ability and perceptual speed, there seems to be a steady incline starting in your late 30s. So some of us do recognize this is actually happening to us, unfortunately, but I think it's important to know what is going on in the brain and in terms of our performance and our cognitive capacity as we get older, if we were to develop solutions for this. Now, this is the non-pathological side. If you take the pathological side as well, if you take disease conditions like Alzheimer's and dementia, these conditions also take a very long time to sort of manifest themselves. So this diagram shows how one would go from normal cognition to a disease state where you actually start to see functional deficit, memory deficits, and so on. What's really interesting is that time and time again, research has shown that this takes decades or not years for some people. So in a person who's seemingly cognitively intact, you might be, if you look at their brain, if we had the capacity to at that stage, you might see there's amyloid beta accumulation happening and also tau-mediated neuronal injury and also some structural brain changes happening at the earlier stages. So remember, this is when a person is cognitively normal, but then there are changes that are, as we're sort of learning now, are detectable inside your brain happening at that time as well. So to me, this really presents a window of opportunity where we can think about the fact that there's many years preceding the disease states. So can we really think of these years as opportunities for early detection and even prevention in some cases? And this idea that, this life course approach is really important came to me during some of the work that I did at the NIA during my postdoc as well. This is work that was published several years ago. In this, what we did was we looked at metabolic markers. So these are not directly related to the brain, but I just want to quickly show how, these life course changes can apply to what we might be looking at for late stage outcomes. So here we looked at data from the Baltimore Longitudinal Study of Aging, which is one of the longest standing longitudinal studies of aging in the US and also in the world. It was started in the 1950s by Dr. Nathan Schock, and it's collected literally decades of data, which is a gold mine for researchers who are interested in doing this type of work. So I really encourage people to look into these types of longitudinal studies. There are many others happening around the world as well. And I believe there are some efforts currently happening as well, maybe in Singapore. So what we looked at were 3 different metabolic markers. We looked at fasting blood glucose, body weight, and waist circumference changes in both males and females across the lifespan. And what we saw was very interesting. So it seemed like through middle age, there was an increase for a lot of these metabolic markers to increase. And then after middle age, there was almost like directionality change in these trajectories, which was very interesting to see. So again, going back to the point I made in relation to cognition, there's really a window of opportunity in these earlier stages when there might be, this accumulation of certain metabolic changes, inflammatory changes, and other changes as well. So being able to identify what those changes are and targeting them early should really be a focus of a lot of the work that we do. Again, no need to stress the importance of, age in Alzheimer's disease and cognitive decline that's related to aging. What we see here that has used data from the Global Burden of Disease Project is how the number of deaths resulting from Alzheimer's disease globally increases starting from about 60 to 65 years and then exponentially increases as your age goes up. Again, this is information that we've already recognized, the fact that aging is really one of the biggest risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. This has also been recognized by other groups within the context of dementia prevention, and how can we navigate this landscape of taking into consideration aging and the fact that aging happens on a continuum into dementia. So this is work that was done by the Lancet Commission report that came out in 2024, and their focus is really dementia prevention, intervention, and care. And in this report, this committee highlighted the importance of breaking down these different risk factors that people face for disease, Alzheimer's disease, over the entire life's course. For example, in early life, having less education is a very powerful risk factor for developing dementia later on in life. And then when you go to middle age, you see risk factors like hearing loss, cholesterol, lack of physical activity, obesity, and so on coming up as important determinants of late life dementia. And then if you go into the late life stage, the important determinants become social isolation, air pollution, visual loss, and so on. So collectively, what this committee concluded is that approximately 45% of these risk factors can be potentially modifiable. And the important thing is to consider the different life courses, because the way these the different risk factors for each life stage, because the way they present themselves at each different life stage is very different. So this has also been recognized at the larger global level as well. So this is work we had the opportunity to be part of. It's an initiative by the WHO, and this work was recently submitted to Lancet Healthy Longevity. So the goal of this framework is to really extend the benefits of healthy aging across the lifespan. So really considering what interventions, what domains are critically important for different life stages, like pre-conception, childhood to adolescence, to adulthood, to older adults, and really trying to match the different life stages, understanding that there will be different domains that become more important than others. And trying to understand what interventions could be designed around that is really the goal of this work. So there'll be probably more work coming out of this initiative as well. So since we're in the theme of what's happening around the world, what's happening at the global stage, I really quickly wanted to, ask a question, what's happening in specific countries that might be of interest to you guys. So this is, again, data from the Global Burden of Disease Project, which is essentially an amalgamation of data from diverse data sets. So it could be country-specific, it could be more global data sets. So they put it together, use some standardization methods, and that's how you're able to get this type of data. So here we're looking at Alzheimer's disease deaths per 100,000. And what's interesting is, you may have noticed this in your communities, in your research projects as well, is the fact that this burden of Alzheimer's disease is increasing in many parts of the world. In the United States, there's a huge burden. Globally, Globally, also, you see this uptick starting from in the 1990s. So I wanted to see what's happening in Singapore, because this is a predominantly Singaporean audience. And what's really interesting is it seems like starting from about 2010, according to this data, Alzheimer's deaths have been going up. And then very recently, it seems like it may have surpassed the global numbers. So I'd be very curious to know if there's anybody working in this space right now who's in the audience, whether you've seen similar observations in your clinics or in your cohorts, or just by talking to people anecdotally, do you really see a lot more dementia-related cases and Alzheimer's cases in Singapore? I would just be curious to know. So in collaboration with University of Colombo in Sri Lanka, we decided to sort of look into what's happening in South Asia, because this appears to be an area, a geographical area where things are really not happening in terms of dementia. So what we again saw was that what we saw with the previous graph as well, Alzheimer's burden is increasing. So these are deaths that are shown, but then if you look at the burden or even incidence, you would see a similar trajectory happening over time. So here what we see is that even though these levels in South Asia are not as bad as what you see at the global level, there's an increase. And the hypothesis is that in a few years, these numbers will catch up to what's happening at the global level, with population increases, with risk factors sort of becoming more prominent in these populations and so on. So what was interesting is there are some countries that are performing worse than others. So here in what we saw was Sri Lanka was actually doing much worse than the rest of the region. Interestingly, it's also the country with the highest proportion of older adults in South Asia. And then we also, there's a larger life expectancy in Sri Lanka compared to other countries as well. In addition to this data, we also looked at sort of from a policy angle, what sort of commitment have governments made to improve dementia care and policy in these countries. Unfortunately, what we saw was that not many countries were part of the Global Dementia Observatory, which is done by the WHO. And at the time, for the reporting that was looked at from 2017 to 2019, what we saw was that none of the countries in South Asia in that region were part of the dementia reporting that's usually considered to be sort of a gold standard to understand the burden. However, I think since maybe a few years ago, these efforts have started, and which is very good, especially in countries like India. They're really recognizing that there's a growing burden and a growing need for this, which is actually very good. So hopefully things will start to change in the future. So also very quickly, we wanted to, based on available data, again, this is globally and publicly available data. So this is not, granular enough for us to really understand what's going on. But we looked at some of the risk factors that may be determining what's going on here. And what we were able to see was that high BMI, high fasting glucose, and low physical activity were strongly correlated with what was going on for dementia as risk factors. So this is interesting because South Asians have a high prevalence of cardiovascular disease and metabolic diseases that may co-occur or precede dementia. And this has been seen by other studies. And there is a push to understand South Asian populations better, even in the United States and also elsewhere in the world, just because of the fact that there are so many South Asians, not just in the world, but also immigrant populations in various pockets in different countries. So then the age-old million-dollar question is, we know that there are so many things driving dementia and Alzheimer's disease and cognitive decline related to aging, but can we really do anything about it? So first and foremost, I want to quickly talk about the diagnosis and treatment of Alzheimer's disease. Typically, the diagnosis consists of doing a screening test, diagnostic imaging, and blood biomarkers. Blood biomarkers are still emerging. They are not established clinically yet. However, I think, if you've kept up with the literature recently, there's very encouraging data coming out, especially for phosphorylated tau 217 and a few others as well, that suggest that they could be powerful biomarkers. So imagine a future where, you're able to do a blood test and be able to determine your risk that will, put you onto a treatment regimen. Going on to treatments, unfortunately, things are not looking too good. So whatever's available are not cures. They will mostly help you with symptom control and slowing of the disease progression. This diagram shows a timeline of how Alzheimer's disease drugs have been approved from the 1990s to up until recently. And you see that there several have come into the arena, which is encouraging, suggests that there's commitment, there's some work being done in the field. But I think, the fact that we still don't have cures and the fact that the burden of these disease, you saw some of those graphs, it's just, exponentially increasing, is that we have to really think of as many ways as possible to really tackle this problem. So then there are many barriers and challenges to solving this issue as well. Diagnostic tests and therapeutics continue to be very, very expensive. Cognitive decline, like I said earlier, could be difficult to detect, especially in early stages using current technologies. And then we also unfortunately require trained providers to administer screenings and evaluations. So you really have to go to a qualified, trained doctor, maybe a physician or a neurologist, to be able to get an accurate diagnosis. And then the other thing I want to quickly highlight is cognition is also associated, cognitive decline in particular is associated with a lot of stigma. And this we notice almost every day with populations and patients that we work with. Older adults especially, they don't want to admit to the fact that they might be going through some cognitive decline. So this also appears to be a challenge because, these are people who've lived very full, accomplished lives, and then they get to a point where they might be experiencing cognitive decline and they really don't know how to deal with it. So there's denial at first, and then the journey of getting to a diagnosis can be very slow. So these are problems, practical problems that you have to face and keep in mind as you develop solutions for this problem. So in all of this, I think really what I'm trying to get at is the fact that prevention of incidence and progression can hold great value because of the fact that, therapeutics are not really there yet. Diagnostics are also, making some strides, but I think prevention is something we just have to sort of talk about. And especially for a healthy aging audience, I think there's incredible power in talking about preventive health. So for the longest time, we had sort of thought that, okay, these lifestyle interventions, they could be useful for these types of, cognitive decline outcomes and so on. You may have heard if you do a certain type of exercise, this could be useful. If you eat certain types of foods, this could be useful for your brain and so on. There was sort of siloed scientific data supporting this up until very recently, in my opinion. So this is a publication that came out very recently in July of 2025 from the US Pointer trial. So this was sponsored by the Alzheimer's Association. And basically what they did was they looked at 4 different lifestyle interventions and put it together, packaged it, and did a randomized controlled trial with about 2,000 participants. So these participants had mild cognitive impairment, and what they did was they put them on this trial, randomized them into 2 arms. One arm was a self-guided program. The second one was a very structured program. So the aspects they looked at were physical exercise, health monitoring, nutrition, and cognitive exercise. And then over a 2-year period, they observed these individuals and measured cognitive performance. And what was actually very interesting to see is that overall, both groups who had mild cognitive impairment, by being either on the self-guided program or the structured program, did much better over time in terms of cognitive performance. However, the structured program individuals did so much better than the self-guided program. So essentially suggesting that, even if people have signs of mild cognitive impairment, by making certain lifestyle changes in a very structured way, they can improve their cognitive performance over time. So this was very exciting to see. And in the next couple of slides, I want to quickly go through what might be happening at the deeper level. So these are large, sort of interventions that anybody can take on, but asking the question of how is this happening, what might be going on, is also important to understand as scientists, right? So very quickly, I want to focus on three different aspects. The first is physical activity. In the Pointer trial, they looked at aerobic training, resistance training, and stretching, balance, and range of motion. And this is what appeared to have given rise to an improvement. And this is unpublished data that we are currently working on. We looked at a TBI cohort, or a brain injury cohort from the NHANES study, which is a nationwide study conducted in the United States to understand determinants of various different health outcomes. So here, what we actually saw was that physical activity, people who indulge in physical activity actually reported, the number of people who reported having problems related to TBI related, limitations were actually much lower than the people who did not do any physical activity. So again, this is preliminary data. We're working on this. So there is a possibility that physical activity may protect against TBI-induced limitations. And we all know that TBI is a risk factor for dementia later on in life. So perhaps this could be used as an intervention to reduce those types of damage as well. What about the nutrition? What about diet? The MIND diet is what was used in the US Pointer trial. It's a version of the Mediterranean diet that also adds in salt control and salt restriction. There are several dietary patterns and ingredients that have been considered to be brain healthy, good for the brain, protective against cognitive decline, like the Mediterranean diet, the DASH diet, MIND, ketogenic diets, certain vitamins, minerals, fatty acids, probiotics, and so on, and also some fasting regimens. There's some data telling us that this could be beneficial. Now, if you break it down a little bit, what seems to be happening, you might be asking the question, how does the diet affect the brain, right? And to me, it seems like, we have macro, micro, and phytonutrients that we take in from these diets. And these molecules can have a profound effect on biological responses. So through modulating neuroinflammation, oxidative stress, synaptic plasticity, microbial activity, and also genetic pathways likely, and many others as well, right? These diets can actually have a net benefit on brain-related outcomes. So very quickly, this is not directly related to the brain. I just wanted to show some data that I generated back when I was a postdoc, again, at the University of Pittsburgh. This is looking at, some of you may be familiar with this compound, sulforaphane, which is the main bioactive component present in broccoli or derived from broccoli. So in this study, what we did was we gave sulforaphane to rats, or a vehicle control to these rats over a long period of time. And then we measured certain lipid species or fatty acid species in the serum of these rats. And what we saw was that in the rats that were given sulforaphane, there was a reduction in certain lipid species like palmitic acid, and non-statistically significant reductions in stearic acid, oleic acid, linoleic, and arachidonic acid, and so on. So if you've kept up with the Alzheimer's literature, what you will see is that also some of these lipid species are actually correlated with cognitive decline and Alzheimer's disease progression and incidence and so on. So there is this idea that perhaps by eating certain dietary ingredients, we might be able to elicit cytoprotective pathways that will result in a net benefit for the brain as we get older. What about cognitive training? All of you may have heard that, taking on doing puzzles, learning a new language, or, doing Sudoku as you get older could be potentially beneficial for the brain. And it's actually, there's some scientific evidence behind it. As we get older, aspects of working memory, learning, sensory capacity, executive function, and reasoning can reduce. So really focusing on these areas and doing memory training, attention and focus, processing, executive function related tasks can really help you keep your brain sharp. There's evidence accumulating towards this. I think there are ways to design the program around it so that these can be more beneficial than not. So these are also areas that we're working on. Okay, so I've highlighted all of the problems right now. So the question becomes, what can we do about it? And this is a solution that we are currently working on, taking into consideration everything that I talked about and other challenges in the field as well. We're calling it the RU Cognitive Companion, focusing on 3 different aspects: cognitive health risk identification, cognitive health tracking, and cognitive health resilience. We've done a prototype launch in Central Texas with a group of older adults with very good feedback for this, and we're continuing to do so. And we're currently also seeking partners in the longevity and wellness space, geriatric clinic spaces, and also elder care spaces. So if anybody is working in these and actively has an interest in it, so please get in touch with me. We'd love to chat more about it. So before I leave, I want to sort of, highlight something, large, in some ways also philosophical, right? I think we really live in a paradox. We've talked about brain pathologies of the brain and the problems that the brain faces and how we could sort of solve it as we get older. I think on the one hand, our brains are at our best due to medical breakthroughs that we've made, technologies that we have developed, and also scientific advancements that have led to us understanding the brain a lot more at the single cell level even. And at the, we understand what are some of the drivers of brain pathology, and how we can really target them is really realistically possible in a very long time. On the other hand, though, I think it's also important that we recognize and encourage thinking that our brains are also in some ways at our worst, right? There's a huge rising mental health crisis, especially affecting our younger generations. There's also cognitive health challenges affecting our older adult populations because we've essentially been able to extend our lifespan, but not necessarily our cognitive health span. So this has given rise to a big set of problems as well. And then collectively, I think we could also say that it has given rise to an erosion of resilience due to the fact that all of these problems are really coming together at this point. So in some ways, the factors that have contributed to the advancement of our brains are also the same factors that are contributing to its decline. So keeping this in mind, I think when you ask the question, where do we go from here? I think solutions to address cognitive vitality as we get older must really span multiple different areas. This goes from individuals to healthcare, to science, to community, to technology, to education policy, maybe some areas that I don't even include here. However, what I want to highlight is that advancement in one area without others won't unfortunately be enough as we move forward. And I think with this revolutionary breakthroughs that we're making literally every day with AI, we have a great opportunity at hand to really make solutions that will allow our brains to thrive as we get older. And it's only if our brains can thrive, can we also thrive. So with that, I'd like to take any questions and stay in touch with me. My email is here. We're also on social media, so follow us and stay in touch. And thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dushani. Thank you for this very informative and beautiful talk. Yeah, I do agree that we do live in a bit of a paradox. I mean, with all the advancement that we have in biology, and we keep studying that, on the other end, we live in a very, let's say, difficult moment and stressful in terms of societies that challenges us every day, right? So perhaps we can start with a few questions, a bit, touching about the different points that you discussed, right? So a little bit starting more from the, I would say, differentiation of the dementia that you mentioned, the fact that we need to differentiate between disease and, let's say, cognitive decline. My question is a little bit regarding especially biomarkers, right? So based on your experience, the studies that you have mentioned, and also the work that you're doing, what do you think are really at the moment, let's say, the best biomarkers that we have, let's say, to differentiate early signs of, let's say, decline in cognitive function versus, for instance, disease, which may be already a bit too late to intervene, right?
Yeah, this is actually a very good question. Unfortunately, I think for very early stages, we don't have a whole lot available. So for disease diagnosis, I think, when somebody has pathological, changes that have happened, it's full blown, and, you have cognitive deficit, you have motor deficit. I think, if you do let's say a brain imaging scan, that is really the best way of detecting, and I would say also the most reliable way of detecting disease in these individuals. And then that along with, so typically what happens is you report symptoms and you go to a doctor, and then you sort of go through the pipeline of a screening test, and then maybe neuropsychiatric evaluation types of testing. So it does take a little bit of time, and then finally you would do an imaging, and then try to determine whether there's amyloid plaque accumulation in the brain and so on, and then you get on. I think the problem becomes a lot more complicated in early stages, right? So this is when you don't really see any, memory impairment for the most part, or you don't really, see any motor deficits. So for the most part, people are cognitively normal. So the challenge is to be able to identify those, and I think that's really where biomarkers can play an immensely powerful role. There's a lot of research happening in this area. I think one of the things that seems to be very hot in this space right now is phosphorylated tau 217. So I encourage everybody to sort of keep an eye out for this. This is something that keeps coming up in research studies, really showing that it could be used as an early biomarker, even through a blood test, really. So I think that's one thing that I'm very excited about, because I think having a blood test, having something that could have enough sensitivity to be detected earlier on in the disease progression spectrum would really be game-changing, I think.
Right. And maybe connecting to this, yeah, I do agree. This is one of the perhaps best ways we have at the moment, together with imaging of the brain, of course. But what about, for instance, in the discussions that you have also with with the framework from WHO and so on, there is all these studies now upcoming in terms of, especially working in the prevention side, right? So there's biological clocks, for instance, and many big labs also in US are doing, right? So I'm actually here in the Cold Spring Harbor in China, and I listened to the talks from Tony Viscore, Vadim Gladyshev, talking about organ-specific clocks, and they also talk about brain clocks, right? Which they can even allow, to some extent, prediction of loss of cognitive health, right? So is it something that is in discussions there to implement actually this, right, even on top or even before using the disease pathological biomarkers that you mentioned?
Yeah, I love this question, because I think I have so many thoughts going through my head regarding this. So I think first and foremost, working at the policy level and doing a little bit of work with the WHO, I really recognize the fact that there's such a huge gap in terms of where research is and where policy is and where policy is looking to go, right? So I think we're doing incredible work at the research level. I think it's truly mind-blowing and groundbreaking, some of the work of the research that you mentioned also. And I think clocks are making progress in the research phase, but I think there's still an issue of getting it not just to the clinical space, right? But now you're talking about policy, which is much larger. So you have to be able to show that this is something that will work at the population level. And unfortunately, I don't think any of the clocks that I have seen have really made it that far. I think there's certainly interest in these circles and policy circles in, to be able to incorporate and integrate, biomarkers like clocks into their work. However, I think they look for evidence, and the evidence has to sort of, not just come from a few sources. It has to sort of converge at a certain point in order for policies to be affected. I think it's really the direction we should be taking, rather than thinking, oh, we're going to develop a new clock and then, sort of wrap things up there. Really, I think the pipeline needs to stretch from there on and say, how do we make this into a policy where you could use this as a measurement to measure how people are aging at the population level. Unfortunately, I think there's a little bit of a gap in terms of how things are moving. It's almost like these fields are moving in parallel and not necessarily converging towards each other. But I think there are some, I think there was a study that I recently read about, maybe it was in Nature, the ABC, that's happening in China, that's, prioritizing looking at so conducting this study with the goal of looking at clocks right? So we have a lot of data right now from various different sources, various different large studies, but unfortunately, due to the fact that many of these studies are not standardized and they don't have the study samples needed probably to run a good, maybe say, methylation clock or so. That there's a need to also set up new studies that can prioritize validating and measuring these clocks in some of these populations. So I think when I saw that study, that was the first thing that crossed my mind. It's like, okay, so you're keeping a clock in mind when you set up the study, and then when you get the data, you have everything that you need to set up a clock and then validate it and see how it behaves in this large, in this case, it was a Chinese population. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think also specific clocks for specific cohorts will also be required. I mean, given the differences that you mentioned, for instance, in risk factors associated also later on with dementia. And I had a question about that, and then perhaps afterwards we can go to the questions from the audience. So you mentioned, for instance, in specific population like Southeast Asia populations, there are all these different also risk factors, right? So BMI and so on and so on. So based on this program that you mentioned, also different ways to intervene with lifestyle habits. Let's say in the context of Singapore, to make it relevant for us here, is there one particular habit or multiple habits? And what kind of program would you suggest or would you envision that in terms of adjusting lifestyle factors that should take a priority?
Yeah, this is why I think personalization needs to be critically integrated into these programs. So one size fits all is unfortunately not going to happen.
Yeah, it's not going to work.
So very correct, Vincenzo. I think, for different populations, the things that drive their risk is very different. And then not to mention also for populations, there are cultural aspects that you have to take into consideration as well. So for example, there are some populations that are just notoriously, against exercising. So, the solution for us is not saying, okay, well, if you're not going to exercise, this is not going to work for you. We're going to go to somebody else, but really to work with them and try to understand how you can develop a solution that works for them, right? So this is an aspect that we are really addressing or trying to address in the programs that we are developing as well. We don't have, I guess, a short answer to say, okay, across the board in a population, what seems to be working, other than the fact that, in countries like the United States, for example, lack of physical activity and obesity are some of the strongest drivers, right? Whereas, in a different population, it could be something else. So in South Asian populations, I think what you see is that fasting glucose and metabolic changes related to glucose metabolism are really some of the drivers. And there's an incredible amount of hidden undiagnosed diabetes in these populations and so on. So I think in a nutshell, I would say you need a personalized approach. You need to look at the population. And the most important thing is when you do studies, you have to get feedback from them and ask them, right? So this is something that I had no idea about. This is something I'm becoming more familiar with, as an entrepreneur and as somebody who's trying to develop a company and a business and a startup. We have to go to people and get feedback from them continuously. Right. So I think that's an aspect where, it's really a learning opportunity for us as researchers who are working on these solutions to get feedback from them to say, okay, what works for you, what doesn't work for you, and then continuously also get feedback once people are enrolled into these programs is also critically important.
Yeah, certainly following up, especially getting feedback to make constructive and evolving further the tools will be important. And with this, I think now we can move actually to some questions also from the audience. We can have Fukai back here to moderate the questions from the floor. So Fukai, any questions that are pressing now to discuss?
Yeah. Thanks, Vincenzo. Thanks, Dr. Dushani. That's a very nice presentation, and I really learned a lot. I think there are a lot of questions. So first, I think we can start from the epigenetic part. So the audience asked one question: what about the epigenetic aging and the brain health events? It seems that there is a bidirectional association between both, like the stroke and the dementia accelerate epigenetic aging, and the epigenetic aging increase the likelihood of all those kind of conditions.
Yeah, that's actually a good point. I think, there's a lot of research being done in this area. I think epigenetics is a critical driver for what might be happening with the brain. So as we get older, so with age, there are different exposures that we go through, and the brain also faces these types of exposures, right? So I think it's very important to be able to, identify what those changes are. I don't think there's across the board signatures that we have identified that seems to be recurrent in terms of epigenetics and brain aging, but this is an active area of research. And with regard to the bidirectionality, that's also very true, because in some cases, epigenetic factors can accelerate brain aging, and in some cases, accelerated brain aging can, result in epigenetic alterations. So I think, there's a very steep relationship between the two, and I think we need to be able to study this further and identify really, the goal should be to identify epigenetic signatures across the span in multiple different populations in order to be able to use it as something that could be clinically useful or useful at the population level.
Cool, thank you. Thank you for this. Another question is about how does brain plasticity influence learning in adulthood compared to the childhood?
Yeah, so there's actually quite a bit of evidence for this. I think neuroplasticity reduces with age. There's some evidence suggesting that. Which is really one of the not the only factor, but one of the determinants of the fact that our brains are not able to process things as fast and learn things as fast and so on. However, I would sort of try to switch the discussion in a more positive direction, saying that some of these interventions that I talked about and some that I didn't have the time to talk about do show that some of these effects could be not just slowed down, but also maybe reversed in some cases. No, that reversal does not mean that you're restoring the brain capacity completely, but at the same time, you might be able to restore some function that you're losing over time due to the loss of neuroplasticity. So again, I think some of these interventions can have a net benefit on the brain, and one of the mechanisms by which it does it is through altering neuroplasticity that's lost as we get older.
Yeah, cool. Another question is about the cognitive decline. So what happens in the brain during the cognitive decline?
Yeah, so like I said, there are, at the very, cellular level, there are many changes that are happening. So there are inflammatory changes that happen, that metabolic alterations that happen as well. So those are some of the, some people believe that those are some of the more earlier sort of pathological signaling types of changes that happen. And then, the main one that we talk about with regard to cognitive decline related to Alzheimer's disease is amyloid beta accumulation. So this is sort of, what you might read about. This is the amyloid hypothesis essentially is really, something that has driven the field for many decades at this point. So depending on who you talk to, I think now researchers are really leaning towards the fact that amyloid is probably a consequence, not necessarily a causation of decline. I think it's probably a bit of both. So I think, and then there's also phosphorylated tau tangles, so these neuronal tangles that also build across in certain brain regions as you get older as well. So I would say signaling changes due to epigenetics, genetics, and other factors, and then driven by some of these more structural changes that are sort of preceded by or co-occurred by amyloid beta, tau tangles, and so on. And then there's also a reduction in brain mass in some cases, but that appears to happen a little later on in the disease progression. And then once that happens, when you're so the brain regions, there are different brain regions responsible for different functions, right? Like I said. So once those areas start becoming affected due to amyloid accumulation, that's sort of followed by some of the earlier changes that I talked about, then the function related to that brain region will also decline. So memory is sort of something that's driven by the hippocampus. So when you see these changes happening in the hippocampus, your memory declines, and then when your memory declines, there are other changes that you will also start to see that could be more motor neuronal as well. So that's really how the decline happens. I hope I answered the question.
Yeah, cool. Thank you. Then let's go back to the WHO life courses approach. So how can the WHO life course approach framework be practically used at different phases of the life to successfully retain cognitive function and combat the risk factors for cognitive decline demonstrated in the aging progression?
Yeah, so this is actually the big challenge. Right now, the WHO life course approach is actually focused on multiple different domains, including the cognitive domain. So I think right now where the work's at, the goal is to be able to identify markers that could be used across the lifespan, and how those markers need to be modulated in terms of utility. What we sort of run into, and an observation that I've sort of made, is the fact that we don't have evidence that could be used. So, for example, in the cognition space, there's quite a bit of evidence from the literature in terms of research in neurodevelopment and for childhood. The timelines. There's not a whole lot in the middle age. And then, we have some work for older adults because of dementia and Alzheimer's disease and so on. So unfortunately, there's, like I said, I talked about this in my talk as well. So there's a lack of information, a lack of focus, a lack of prioritizing what happens in our middle ages. And I think this is also contributing to the fact that we're not able to really sort of match this life course because of the fact that there are some snippets of missing data. However, there are ways to address it, and this is one of the things that the WHO Life Course group is, actively working towards. So hopefully, in the years to come, we'll be able to, get more concrete and solid answers to this question.
Yeah,
I think we have time for one more question, Fukai, for a brief question and answer. Yeah.
Okay. Then that's the best question for the last one. So I ask this question for everyone who wants to working on brain aging. So since you are the expert on brain aging research, could you please share with us what is the golden standard of brain aging research? For example, if somebody wants to study brain aging from zero, what is the best strategy to reach a good result?
Oh, that's a great question. So first of all, I wouldn't call myself a brain expert. I really came to it through interventions. So I've done a lot of intervention types of work, which brought me to the brain, right? So I think for anybody who is interested in, looking at the brain, I think it's important to, get a good understanding of the biology of the brain and biology of aging of the brain. I think that's the most important part. There's still a lot of unknown, and I think there's a lot of work being done. There's a lot of research that's happening in that space. So first and foremost, before you think about setting up studies or any of that, learn about that if you're a complete novice. If you have experience in that space, I think there's a lot of the brain is a different organ. It has a mind of its own, if I may say. So I think it's a very complex organ. It's a beautiful organ. There's a lot of things that we currently don't know about it. And I think you have to be able to, if you are doing a study, my advice is bring on collaborators. And that's what I have done as well. So I'm not an expert on the brain by no means, but I have some excellent, really good, great collaborators who are true experts in this field. So what I have done is bring them in, and then, with my expertise in certain areas, we're trying to really create these solutions to these problems. So that's really my advice.
Yeah, and that's a great advice. And thank you also, Fukai, for moderating the questions. And yeah, it's a great way to close the talk and a great advice. We always need collaboration to start and to progress. And studying the brain is very fascinating and very difficult at the same time. But it's good to start with maybe one particular curiosity or interest about a pathway in the brain, and then see who are the experts and set up collaborations. So thank you, Dushani, again for your presentation. And with this, we're going to close the webinar, and I'll give you some updates for the next next webinar. So it's going to happen on October 2. And actually join us for a surprise to see who will be speaking, and the topic will be decided soon. And as a teaser for the next episode, you may recall that last time we started with a teaser for Debbie, one of our research associates, who will be actually moderating in our next episode. If you missed it, we're going to give you a small sneak peek, and we will see you soon. Thank you.
We can imagine that the female reproductive system as a garden. So imagine in the garden you have the soil, which is the endometrium, and of course the seed as the embryo.